ecclesiastic college and chantry before the dissolution. The cottages for the men who'd built it long since converted into the quaint and popular Tower Inn, the chantry now a rather grand private home. As they crested the hill, Carol could see that the village was coming to life. They approached the village school and she caught sight of her best friend Betty Wellings, who was busy shepherding her small charges through the door into the single classroom. Betty was small and fair and had just celebrated her 25th birthday. Had fate been kinder, she would have liked to have joined the WAFs, but she'd been struck down by polio as a child and now walked with a caliper and cane. Yet that couldn't overshadow her enthusiasm for life or her pleasure in teaching the children. Betty must have heard Hector's approach, for she looked up and waved, her beaming smile lighting up her pretty face. "I'll see you at the weekend," she called over the heads of the children. "Are we still going to the pictures?" 2:00 matinee, Carol replied. "See you about 11, and we can have some lunch in town first." Hector plodded on, and Betty went back to her little ones. But Carol's thoughts remained on her friend. They were looking forward to a day out in Kingsbridge, for it was rare for Carol to have a Saturday off, and Betty usually went out with her young man, Ken, whose family owned a large farm at Chillington. Carol thought Ken was a bit of a stick in the mud and not nearly imaginative or bright enough for Betty. They'd been walking out for 2 years, and Betty still hoped he'd pop the question, which made Carol wonder if perhaps Ken was stringing her along. If that was the case, then Carol vowed to give him a good piece of her mind, for Betty didn't deserve to be treated so badly after all she'd gone through. Her years in the orphanage, the trials of recovering from polio, and the struggle to attain her teaching certificate showed that Betty was not easily defeated. But Carol suspected that if Ken let her down, she'd find it hard to recover. Hector's hooves rang on the cobbles as they entered the village, and Carol's gaze was drawn as ever towards the cemetery surrounding the church of St. James the Great. She felt the familiar prick of tears and blinked them away, for they couldn't bring David back or breathe life into the stillborn baby girl who now lay beside him in that lovingly tended plot. And yet the pain was still raw after 8 months, the loss like an open wound which seemed no nearer to being healed. The Shire continued on past the steep cobbled lane where Thyme Cottage overlooked the sweeping fields of the old manor house right down to the sea. David had inherited it from his widowed father, who'd died of lung disease 2 years before the war, and he'd set up his successful carpentry business there before the world had been thrown into turmoil and everything changed. They'd met at a wedding in Dartmouth, and following a whirlwind romance had been married in the centuries-old village church of St. James the Great. David had carried Carol over the threshold into Thyme Cottage for what they'd hoped would be a long, happy future together. But the declaration of war had ruined that dream, and once he'd enlisted, they'd had only a few snatched days of leave to share over the following years, and now he was gone. David had been with Montgomery's 8th Army when they'd broken through the Mareth line in Tunisia back in March. The news of his death had come shortly after she'd written excitedly to tell him about her pregnancy. She'd known he'd received that letter, for it had been opened when it was returned to her, along with the rest of his effects, but there had clearly been no time for him to write a reply. However, the shock of losing him had made her careless and clumsy, and a heavy fall down a slippery flagstone step had brought the baby into the world too soon. The only solace was that her precious little girl was with David, and that one day all 3 of them would be together again. Carol took a quavering breath. David used to say he admired her strength of character and her determination to make the best of things, no matter how difficult life became, and she'd certainly been put to that test. Although he was no longer here, she needed to prove to him and herself that his faith in her was justified, that she wouldn't weaken and let the grief...